with the global stock of CO2 there. We can have similar technologies that we have on the point source carbon capture side, but we also can expand the aperture significantly. We can move into systems that leverage mining and mineral techniques that react with CO2 in the air, and we can also leverage nature-based approaches. Anything from expanding forests through reforestation programs, sequestering carbon in soils using agricultural practices. We can even start to explore how we use our coastal ecosystems, everything from mangrove restoration, all the way into open ocean approaches that would capture CO2 directly from the ocean, which would react with the air and thus effectively be a direct air capture approach using the upper layer of the ocean. So all of these approaches are in scope. And I think it's important to have that broad system in mind, because all of those approaches, I think, present really interesting opportunities across the Gulf region. A little bit about why we are doing this full suite of carbon management approaches. It really boils down to climate. That when our administration ran the numbers on what it's going to take to actually meet the president's commitment to a net zero economy by 2050, it's going to be incredibly important for us to deploy this full suite of solutions, even as we do so many of the other, what I think of as more conventional climate solutions. So installing other types of clean electricity, electrifying our transportation sector, efficiency in our built environment. All of those pieces are critical, and we're going to have to accelerate them. But even if we do that as much as we think is possible in the coming decades, it will be really important for us to deploy the full suite of carbon management to actually get to net zero. The carbon removal wedge alone is likely to be hundreds of millions of tons of carbon taken out of the atmosphere, up to potentially even 1 billion tons of CO2. And so that is both an important challenge, but also an incredible opportunity, because the United States is actually blessed with an enormous resource base to do carbon removal, both on the technological approaches as well as on the nature-based ones. I think what's also really important is that the president directed all of the agencies that are working on carbon management to make sure that the projects are done in a responsible manner. That the president has been clear that climate is not a singular goal. It is part of a broader set of environmental social goals, really designed to create economic and workforce opportunities in communities across the US, and make sure that communities that have borne the brunt of historic pollution from the fossil fuel industry and other industries do not have additional pollution burden added to their communities, and are first in line to be able to benefit from many of the opportunities that these cleaner alternatives present. And so it's really that multivariate policy goal that we have around not just how do we deploy this for climate, but how do we make sure that these solutions really lift up the communities that are most threatened by climate and have borne the largest brunt of pollution in the past. And so where that really leads us is we don't see a single silver bullet, if you will, when it comes to any of these solutions. But instead, we think it's really important that we deploy a portfolio of approaches, all of which hold promise, none of which we have confidence are going to work at a massive scale. But that makes it all the more important that we deploy them today in the local context that make the most sense from a technical and economic perspective, and where the community is most excited about taking advantage of the potential economic opportunities and other environmental and workforce opportunities afforded by these solutions. About 2 years ago, the secretary announced a carbon negative shot as a framing challenge for us. This is an incredibly ambitious goal of bringing down the cost of large-scale carbon removal to below $100 a ton, inclusive of that robust measurement, reporting, and verification. And so in order to do that, we've really expanded the aperture on the types of solutions that are in scope. We similarly are linking all of our carbon removal work to the broader carbon management and decarbonization efforts at the Department of Energy. It's really a historic moment at DOE in terms of the investments that we are making in the full suite of clean energy and industry processes. We have $60+ billion from the bipartisan infrastructure law and from the Inflation Reduction Act to invest in pilots and demonstrations of the full range of clean technologies that are going to be the cornerstones of our future net zero economy. Carbon management is a key component of that, with roughly $12 billion of dedicated funding. This is everything from carbon capture systems associated with power plants and heavy industry, direct air capture systems, and then all of the associated infrastructure to actually manage that CO2 once it has been captured, either from an existing emission source or directly from the air. And so that involves transportation, whether it's through CO2 pipelines, rail or ship networks, and then use or storage of that CO2. We have programs to convert CO2 into value-added products such as building materials, chemicals, and we also have a significant program to store CO2 geologically. We have been doing this for decades in the United States already at scale, but we haven't expanded at the level that we will need to in order to unlock the full climate potential of these solutions. And so DOE is investing heavily in the storage opportunities for CO2 deep underground across the United States, as well as expanding where we can do storage by thinking about novel approaches like enhanced weathering. This is effectively grinding up rocks that would react with CO2 in air or oceans and figuring out how to deploy that, whether it's for beach nourishment, it's for agricultural pH management. There's a whole bunch of opportunities associated with this more novel type of CO2 storage. I think what's important to recognize is that the CO2 capture technologies that we have are fairly technically mature. They just are more expensive than the market is willing to pay today. The market for this technology is, importantly, it's a policy-driven market. The only reason that we are doing carbon management is climate. We want to reduce CO2 emissions. And so there needs to be some incentive for companies to actually do this. What we see is that there is now a 45Q tax credit, as it's known. This is a production tax credit similar to the production tax credits for wind energy, for example, that we've seen for decades, that in the Inflation Reduction Act was increased to $85 a ton for dedicated capture and storage associated with point sources, and $180 a ton specifically for direct air capture and storage. What's important to note is that there are a handful of sources that we think are cost-effective under this 45Q tax credit alone. That's the far left-hand side of this graph in the dark green. Things that have very high concentrations of CO2, making it much easier to capture. Natural gas processing, ethanol fermentation, hydrogen production. However, the vast majority of emissions happen in more dilute CO2 streams, whether that's in power plants, in industrial facilities. It's really important that we figure out how to increase the incentive for these approaches over time, as the costs of these first-of-a-kind projects are, in almost all cases, higher than that $85 a ton. With additional DOE incentives, we can bring down that cost and are funding a number of projects to do just that. But there's going to need to be additional leadership from industry and policymakers alike to make many of these carbon removal and carbon capture technologies economic in the near term so that we can get them started down a learning curve and be more cost effective in the future. I know we don't have too much time left here, and I want to create space for questions. But I think what's really important is that the Department of Energy is really taking a holistic approach to our carbon negative and our carbon capture portfolios. We are thinking about not just the technical aspects of these projects, but really investing in how we have a robust carbon management industry of the future. That to us means community benefits and environmental protection. So investing in the types of environmental monitoring that are going to need to accompany these solutions, both to assess the carbon impacts, as well as to make sure that there's no other unintended pollution in these communities that are willing to host projects. At the same time, we want to make sure that we are critically working with the private sector. We know that, as we say, these projects are government funded, but are going to be industry led at the end of the day. There is no requirement in most cases for companies to actually do carbon management. And so it really requires industry leadership and community leadership to take advantage of the benefits of these subsidies that are available today. I think it's also important to know what DOE actually does on this front. Historically, our major source of funding is through applied innovation. We give lots of grants out for small scale pilots all the way up through now commercial demonstrations. But we're also investing heavily in a number of other components that are going to make up the carbon management ecosystem of the future. To give folks a sense of the types of projects that we're working on, I wanted to just share this map of all of the different direct air capture hubs that we've invested in as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. You'll note that the multiple colors here represent multiple stages of development. The blue projects are really just feasibility studies. The green projects dealing with actual engineering and design analyses in specific applications. And then the yellow projects representing full-scale demonstrations that are in detailed design today and will move to construction in the coming years. So what I think is important to note that this is just one sliver of the carbon management equation. This is just direct air capture projects. And we're seeing opportunities across the United States to advance this technology and to provide opportunities. It is worth noting that once you add more dots on the map, it almost becomes a little unintelligible given the scale of investments that we're making here. But I think what's really important to note is the cluster of innovation projects that we funded around the Gulf Coast. This is an area that we think offers enormous potential, both from a technical resource base, where there are a lot of emission sources well suited to carbon capture, nearby ample geologic storage opportunities, as well as existing infrastructure, both in terms of CO2 transportation, as well as a workforce that knows how to build and operate projects similar to carbon capture and storage efforts. We think this is an enormous opportunity for the Gulf Coast to be able to leverage the existing heavy industrial base that has been developed and to evolve that industry into one that can be clean and sustainable and aligned with net zero economy-wide emission goals in the future. The last thing I'll note is that the DOE is mostly focused on the technology approaches, but is investing in a lot of the nature-based approaches from a measurement, reporting, and verification perspective. That at the end of the day, many of the nature-based approaches, such as reforestation or coastal ecosystem restoration, don't require substantial technology innovation. We know how to plant trees, we know how to restore our coastlines. The question is, how do we actually measure the carbon associated with those projects? And so DOE is investing heavily there. We also see an enormous opportunity for offshore CO2 storage and CO2 removal opportunities in the ocean, and are investing in innovation projects focused on that front. The last piece that I'll float is that the Department of Energy is aligned with the broader Biden administration's efforts to include community benefit plans in all of our major investments. These community benefit plans are really a new muscle for the Department of Energy. Historically, we've really been focused on the technology innovation and the economic aspects of projects. Now we've expanded to require every project that applies for DOE funding to have a plan that will include these benefits on both workforce and community benefit, environmental protection, front and center among that. And so it's something that we are really excited about and are continuing to evolve and refine, because we know that these projects hold enormous opportunity and that they won't be able to realize the potential of the climate or economic impacts unless they're being driven with the community's front and center. I think I'm going to pause there. I have a lot more detail in this presentation when it comes to what we're doing across the full carbon removal spectrum. Happy to share more details with folks as we get into the questions. But maybe, Amy, I can turn it back over to you and open the floor for any Q&A.
Thank you, Noah. Really appreciate this. Super helpful start to the conversation around carbon capture here from the national level, and then to see already, as we know, some exciting things happening in this region already. So we have a couple of questions that have come up, and Pamela, I'm happy to just jump in and share those with Noah and see if we can get those answered. The first one is around with injection underground or into the ocean. What is the risk of lowering the pH too low and impacting aquatic life or well water sources?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll actually separate these things. When we talk about injecting CO2 underground, we are injecting it very deep underground, miles down in most cases. And in order to even get a permit to do this injection, the site has to be characterized so that there is an effective cap rock or other way to trap the CO2 from getting anywhere near the surface, anywhere near any source of drinking water, quite frankly. And so when we're talking about CO2 injection under the ocean, we're not talking about the shallow seabed. It's really very, very deep and has an extremely low risk of coming back and getting into the ocean water if it's well regulated. And none of these projects can happen without a permit. So that's one piece. On the other hand, there are a lot of approaches that are about increasing the alkalinity of the ocean. So not injecting the CO2 itself, but injecting it's basically a big Tums for the ocean. We know that the ocean is too acidic. So how do we actually add alkalinity back into the ocean and rebalance the pH? So what we actually have is the opposite direction of figuring out how do we make sure that our marine ecosystems can look more similar to the oceans that existed in decades and centuries past. And this is a really important effort. In many cases, it's an economic effort on shellfish nurseries and so forth, where the economic value of these crops depends on ecosystems where the water is not too acidic for these species to survive or really thrive. And so I think that's the big differentiation there.
Yeah, and just to clarify, just to make that's such an important point we've been hearing about in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, the acidification leading to damage for the shellfish industry because the shells, of course, can't live in a too acid environment. And so given the importance of that to the Gulf region, clearly very relevant. And that was the second question, was really around the consequences of any ocean related carbon capture activity, and whether it would actually create a more acid environment. But what we just heard from you is you're focused on both mitigating any impact of deep well injection and working to actually create a more alkaline environment. Is that that right?
Yeah, and I would just say that we are extra cautious about anything that involves ocean ecosystems. Just from a US government-wide regulatory standpoint, there's actually a White House interagency task force right now about how to make sure that anything involving marine carbon removal work across any of the solutions is done with an extra eye towards safety. And so that work is underway now. And it's not just about the pH levels of the ocean, but it's about all of the different impacts to ocean ecosystems, ocean fisheries, and economic.
Thank you. The question that just popped in, you did cover this early in the presentation about Department of Energy looking at green methods of carbon capture, biological methods, reforestation, shellfish farming. And you did cover that a bit, but the focus being on the monitoring and the measurement really of nature-based carbon capture. Is that
Yeah, and I'll be honest, that's a quirk of, not a quirk. Congress gives us a lot more money to do the technologies than the nature-based approaches. And we
yeah,
work closely with sister agencies that do more work in either nature-based ecosystems on land or in ocean. So USDA, NOAA, Department of Interior, those agencies collaborate closely with us.
great. Well, we're going to have our third webinar will be about nature-based solutions and opportunities for economic investments in the region to restore natural systems, including with carbon capture benefits. We did have a question pop in. We're a little over time. Let's see. Oh, is managed retreat a strategy being utilized by DOE, meaning hard carbon storage ecosystems around the Gulf are being directly impacted by sea level rise?
So I would say that DOE is more focused on the technology innovation pieces. How do we figure out how to develop the types of technologies, and those technologies will be used to reduce and remove emissions in the first place. I think when we think about specific projects, we don't want to build projects in ecologically sensitive areas or areas that are prone to ecological disaster in the future as a result of climate change. So that's a function of where we make our investments. But no, we are not actively supporting strategies to do anything like managed retreat.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Thank you so much. This last question is about the status of 45Q incentives around utilization of CO2 for beverages. If you can just answer that quickly, and then we better cut off the questions for you here. But as other questions come in, we can share them with you and then share them back to the Business Resource Committee as well.
Yep, and I would just say that the status of 45Q incentives around utilization, they exist. There is a process where our team at the Department of Energy and our National Energy Technology Lab evaluate the life cycle carbon accounting associated with various 45Q utilization applications. We work closely with Treasury to implement that. So that's an ongoing process, and we'd be happy to share more if that's helpful.
Great, thank you. We'll do some follow-up with some resources that we can share following this webinar with the participants and the broader committee as well. So thank you so much for joining us today and for the work you're doing at DOE to advance carbon capture efforts. And we look forward to staying in touch and hopefully developing some real opportunities here, continue to build on the existing leadership in the region around carbon capture and storage. So thanks again.
No, and Amy, thank you. Our door is open, so please feel free to reach out if there are any other specific questions about this broad umbrella of carbon management. We're always happy to chat.
Great, thank you again. All right, with that, we're going to move on to our next set of speakers and bring to more direct understanding of what's happening in the Alabama region. Excited to have John Northington, who's director of the National Carbon Capture Center, which is a U.S. Department of Energy sponsored research facility managed and operated by Southern Company. And John is also the director of Net Zero Technologies for Southern Company Research and Development. And in his capacity, he has responsibility for their current, emerging, and future research programs in carbon storage, carbon utilization, direct air capture, steam methane reforming with carbon capture, biomass energy production with carbon capture and natural systems, as well as sustainability. In 2019 and 2020, he's chair of the technical committee technical subcommittee, sorry, for the Carbon Utilization Research Council, an industry coalition focused on technology solutions for the responsible use of fossil energy resources in a balanced portfolio to support the nation's need for reliable, affordable energy. He was co-chair of the carbon capture subgroup in the development of a report meeting the dual challenge, a roadmap at scale deployment of carbon capture use and storage, a study by the National Petroleum Council. He also oversees support of the International Test Center Network, a global coalition of facilities working on research, development, and deployment of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology. So bottom line, we have the right person for this conversation today to get into the depth of these issues and based right in Alabama. So John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all this morning and looking forward to the discussion. I think Noah provided a great kind of intro to a lot of the work that the Department of Energy is doing. I'm going to talk more specifically about carbon capture, conversion, and then also direct air capture, and the work that we're doing at the National Carbon Capture Center and have been for quite some time. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague who's also with me, Dr. Richard Esposito, to talk more about storage and specifically about the geology in the Southeast and in the state of Alabama. So to begin with, just as an intro to the National Carbon Capture Center, we've been developing carbon capture technologies at the center in collaboration with DOE for well over a decade now. Southern Company manages and operates the facility, and it's located in Wilsonville, Alabama, very close to Birmingham. And the thing that's unique about the facility, and I think is really important when you think about developing technologies, is giving those technologies a place to come and test in a real world environment. Now, a lot of them are coming straight out of the laboratory. And so those kind of initial first steps of accelerating towards ultimately large demonstrations and commercial development, the center provides a really beneficial step in that pathway. Our staff there interfaces with the developers as they come through, and we support them really from front to back on incorporation into the site, on operation and testing there at the facility. And we do that. I mentioned the collaboration with DOE. We also collaborate with a lot of industry partners. You see many of those listed on the right-hand side of that slide there. That provide technical input and guidance into the program, and then also help identify technologies that would benefit from testing at the facility. I'll talk a little bit more in a slide later in the deck about our International Test Center Network, but we also help co-found that as well. More specifically about the technology, I mentioned that we've been focused on carbon capture for well over a decade now. We've also recently added in the last 5 years carbon conversion and utilization technologies that take the CO2 and produce value add products from it. And then, as Noah mentioned in his talk, looking at carbon removal and specifically testing of direct air capture technologies where you're removing previously emitted CO2 directly from the air. So in summary now, we've completed over 150,000 hours of technology testing. That represents over 80 technologies from around the world. We've had developers from here in the United States as well as other countries that have come to the facility to test. And during that period of time, from where we started back in 2009 to now, we've been able to drive down the cost of capture by about 40%. And that's a pretty significant reduction. There are obviously additional cost reductions that occur as you start to deploy that technology at commercial scale, and you do it again and again and again, you drive costs down. But during this early stage step, it's really important for the developers to learn where they may have challenges in the way they're approaching things from a technical standpoint that might need to be modified. And then the data that they produce and the information that they produce in testing helps them to be able to confidently scale the technologies up as they move forward. We have a staff of about 125 folks on staff there at the center. And again, we kind of span the entire project management cycle, if you will, from research engineers, operations and maintenance employees, construction staff, all helping to kind of bridge that gap with the developer from that early stage testing, mostly laboratory scale, to something that's more significant. This is kind of some snapshots of our center, and I'll extend the offer to Henry and Amy and you all if there's ever a time that you might want to come and actually visit the center. We host visitors a lot, but this gives you a big picture view of the testing scales. We can test technologies simultaneously at multiple scales. If you want to think about it from a tons of CO2 per day, we can go up as high as 20 tons per day. At our largest system, which you see there on the left-hand side in our pilot bay area. And then we also have smaller scale, bench scale testing, as well as laboratory testing. A lot of our lab scale testing, you may say, well, why do you come to an industrial site to do lab scale testing? But when you're looking at materials development for a lot of the technologies, this is a way to really do some fast down select of materials. And so we've worked quite extensively with a number of developers there as they begin to kind of put their process together from that very early stage. One thing to note as far as capability of the facility, you see a lot of stuff here in the pictures. This infrastructure has been invested in by the Department of Energy, Southern Company, and our partners, and is really there to help the developers. So if a developer was going to another site, they don't have to build all this infrastructure to be able to test. They can come in and very quickly bring their equipment and connect it to our infrastructure and begin testing. We have two sources of flue gas at the site. We have a coal-based power generation plant that sits immediately adjacent to us that we can pull into our infrastructure and provide to developers for carbon capture testing on coal. We also have a natural gas system that gives us the ability to mimic natural gas power generation as well. And so a lot of flexibility in what we can provide to the developers. A lot of those gas streams too are applicable in other industries or other sectors. So you think, cement, steel, chemicals, a lot of that has crossover with those industries. And so we talk about testing at our center and the work that's been done there. The other really big important step that we're in the process of right now, and DOE is supporting, is moving these technologies towards demonstration. This slide kind of provides you with a highlight view of the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations program for deploying the technology at a commercial scale. There's feed studies, front-end engineering design studies that have also been implemented. And all of the technologies that you see there that are shaded in that green box have had a part of their development story include the National Carbon Capture Center. And so it's very important as you think about developing the pipeline of technologies, as Noah was speaking about, to have a facility like this that can help to eject these technologies and accelerate them towards commercial development, to be able to do that in a confident and methodical way. Wanted to spend, and I won't get into too much detail here, but wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about carbon capture technologies and approaches. So from the outset, I would like to say that when you think about carbon capture, there are really two main challenges that we're trying to address. We're trying to design a carbon capture system that minimizes the amount of capital costs. So you can think of that in terms of equipment size as one component of the cost. The other cost is how can we make them as efficient as possible? How can we reduce energy penalty? It always takes energy to do something. So if you're doing carbon capture, it will always take energy, but how can we make those systems as efficient and as cost effective from a capital standpoint as we possibly can? And that's been a big focus of our work there at the center. So let me orient you to this slide. On the left-hand side, there are a couple of technologies that I'll cover first. The first there in the top left is absorption. These are the technologies that if you've heard of carbon capture before, you probably have heard the most about. They are kind of technically probably the most mature relative to the other approaches. Have two components. They have an absorber column or tower where the flue gas contacts the solvent, which is capturing the CO2 from that gas. Once the solvent contacts the CO2 and captures it, that solvent is sent over to a regenerator, and that regenerator adds heat. That's the energy penalty. So that's the part we're trying to minimize, but it adds heat to that system to produce the CO2 from the solvent, and then the solvent's recirculated. So if you look at that from a benefit standpoint, those systems can achieve very high capture rates and produce a very pure product stream. Some of the challenges, again, back to what Noah had mentioned, is it's large equipment. So there's high capital costs there. And the energy penalty, because a lot of these systems also have, as a part of the solvent mixture, a lot of water that's included in that mixture. There's an energy penalty for heating that up in the system. The other challenge, and the thing that we're also looking at as we develop these technologies, is any other new volatile emissions that could be produced, and how you control appropriately and monitor for those. So that's a big kind of new focus area in this space, or I won't say new, but a more as we think about the technology now, it's an area we're focusing on. Absorption technology is usually using a solid. So CO2 absorbs onto the surface of that solid, and then you heat the solid up to regenerate the CO2. So very similar in a lot of ways to the solvent-based approaches, and have some of the same challenges with large equipment, high capital cost. Material durability and reliability is also an area of focus. And then as I move to the right-hand side, with membrane separation, starting there, you're really doing just a physical separation. You almost think of it like a filter. You're physically separating the CO2 from your gas stream. Typically has lower costs from a capital standpoint. So the equipment is smaller, typically modular in design. The penalty that you pay there is really more on the O&M side around compression energy. And then finally, cryogenic separation, which is probably the newest approach to carbon capture, still at the pilot scale. And that's where you actually cause the gas stream, by dropping the temperature, you cause the CO2 in the gas stream to undergo a phase change. So you basically produce dry ice from the CO2 that's in the gas stream. Takes a lot of energy to do that. Again, capital costs are lower, but that energy penalty for compression and refrigeration is there. And so there are benefits and challenges in each one of these spaces. The other thing that I'll say is there's, when you think about volumes of CO2, so if you have a large source, you're probably going to be looking more at an absorption or adsorption technology. Where membrane separation and cryogenic separation could be something that might be a lot more applicable to general industry and could represent an electrification of carbon capture. There is no heat input required. It's all compression energy. So again, a lot of information there, but just wanted to highlight that briefly. If you think about current state of the technology, I mentioned the solvent-based absorption technologies lead the field. There are multiple technology providers that are willing to make commercial guarantees. I mentioned kind of some of the current focus areas there on process intensification, integrating it to these various sources. Other technologies are continuing to develop. I mentioned the sorbent membrane and cryogenic separation technologies that could offer more applicability across a broader set of industries. And then we're also, as I mentioned on the outset, continuing to develop direct air capture technology. But that remains at least an order of magnitude higher cost relative to point source capture, just because the CO2 concentration in the air is very, very low. And so to grab those CO2 molecules, it takes a lot more energy relative to the amount of CO2 that you're capturing. So the cost per ton of CO2 is a lot higher. But we're continuing to develop those technologies. I think there's some interesting opportunities on co-location with industry that we're starting to see. A lot of the needs for that technology from a standpoint of heat and other utilities, common infrastructure like storage, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. They can leverage that to help to bring costs down as well as developing the technology. Finally, a couple slides here. Wanted to talk about our International Test Center network. So we are one of many test centers across the globe focused on carbon capture. And have been for a number of years. And we collaborate with these centers in a variety of different ways. Each one provides kind of a unique set of testing conditions. And so there's opportunities for developers to test at multiple sites. We also share common technical challenges and lessons learned. And so, for instance, this year, one of the technical focuses of the network is looking at emissions measurement and monitoring from the capture systems. And so we're kind of working in collaboration with one another to help establish some guidelines and standards around measurement of emissions and making sure that that is developing along with the technology. So a great platform both for the developers to develop the technologies, but also from a knowledge sharing standpoint as well. And then finally, yeah, I mentioned in the beginning, we do collaborate with a lot of industry sponsors, and there's a lot of benefit that is provided to each one of our sponsors there at the site. It's it's an opportunity to see the technologies firsthand, to think about how they need to integrate it into their business as they have net zero goals and aspirations. Developing relationships with the developers as those technologies are developing. And then I mentioned too the fact that it does really provide a real world environment. And so everything that we're doing there at the center to develop the technologies has direct application as they continue to scale up. And so provides a very unique environment for us to do that. So I know we'll take some questions at the end, and I'm glad to provide additional information even after the webinar today. But I'm going to introduce my colleague, Dr. Richard Esposito, and he's going to cover all of our work that we've been doing looking at carbon storage geology across the Southeast. So Richard is our program manager of geosciences and carbon management at Southern Company. He has been in the carbon capture and storage space and been working there for well over 20 years. A lot of experience, has collaborated extensively with DOE through regional partnerships and the Carbon Safe program, which you may have heard of, to really understand where you can do carbon storage in the Southeast. And so I'm going to turn it over to Richard and let him go through our storage work, and then we'll take questions at the end. Richard?
Thanks, John. Yeah, fantastic to be here. I always joke with John and the capture engineers at the National Carbon Capture Center that storage is the tail that wags the dog of CCS. So it's a very important component, and we have to make sure we get this right. We're deploying an environmental technology, but we do not want to have any unintended consequences with storing CO2. So we are spending a lot of time with research and developing this technology and fully understanding it. But it's actually been ongoing for many, many years. So we have a lot of natural analogs. There's existing oil and gas reservoirs that have held hydrocarbons for hundreds of millions of years. We have natural occurring deposits of CO2, even in the Southeast, that we can use as natural analogs. And then from an industrial analog standpoint, there are enhanced oil recovery operations going on where CO2 is actually being injected to produce more oil out of oil fields. And we do natural gas storage. There's natural gas storage that's done down in the Mobile area. We've been doing liquid waste injection and disposal for many years, been doing that very safely, acid gas injection. And now we're looking at, technologies with using the subsurface environment for hydrogen storage, looking forward to some of DOE's goals for hydrogen economies. We're looking at areas where we can do hydrogen storage. And we have a very, frankly, we have a very wide growing portfolio Class 6, which is geological storage wells now in the United States. So not only have we been just building up to doing this technology of CCS with the storage side of it, but there's actually a lot of projects that are moving forward and actually injecting CO2 that we're learning from. Next slide, John, please. So if you look at the Earth below us, it's made up of layers of different rock formations. And for CO2 storage, basically what you need are reservoir rocks, which are rocks that have porosity and permeability that you can inject CO2 into. And if you were to look at a photomicrograph or a magnifying vision of what these rocks look like, they're going to have pore space in between them. They're going to be like sand grains that are compacted together, and they have pore spaces where the CO2 can move. Now, to keep CO2 in the ground for long periods of time, we want to have a rock called a cap rock or a seal, and that rock would have just the opposite. It would have no porosity and permeability. It would be like a layer of rock that would just confine the CO2. Now, I don't want to give the impression that when you inject CO2 in the ground, the first thing it wants to do is start coming up out of the ground. That is not the case. In fact, most of the CO2 that is injected into the reservoir rocks will get trapped in the reservoir rocks. It will get trapped in dead end pore space. It'll mineralize over time. It will dissolve into the brines that are in these formations, these saline formations that we're looking at for storage. Over time, it is possible that some of that CO2 that's not trapped in the reservoir rock will move up, and that's the purpose for these cap rocks or seals. Next slide. So if you look across the United States, there's been a lot of work done on characterizing CO2 storage sites, and we can thank our good friends at the Department of Energy for a lot of that. But any well that's drilled, frankly, for oil and gas activities, or any wildcat well that's drilled for anything, any purpose, is going to provide us with the valuable information. And generally, these storage atlas maps are looking at basins. And so you can look at this map on the right, and it's got different Williston Basin up in the North Dakota area, the Illinois Basin, but the Gulf Coastal Plain, or the Gulf Coastal Basin, is actually the largest storage basin or basin in the United States geologically that has excellent feasibility for storing CO2. I put the map of oil and gas fields on the left because some people are looking at using existing oil and gas fields for CO2 storage. So that opens the door a little bit more for other areas where there's oil and gas fields where you might not find saline reservoirs. But the oil and gas fields they have their challenges. You have a lot of infrastructure and wells that are in these oil and gas fields, so you have to make sure that the structural integrity of those wells are good. But the oil and gas formations are formations that have demonstrated to be good caps and seals for oil and gas reserves. So those are formations that we are looking at. Next slide. So I would say that from the standpoint of characterizing sites, going out and looking at sites for the feasibility of doing storage, that technology is very mature. I feel very comfortable with that. We have, we've drilled wells across our service territory, including down in Mobile. We've done seismic profiling at the surface, 2D and 3D seismic, which helps image the subsurface environment. And when you drill a well and you couple it with seismic, you really get a very interesting and revealing picture of the subsurface environment. Also, when you drill these wells, there's logging tools, geophysical logging tools. We can take cores, send them to laboratories. We can do injection tests of water to test the permeability. All of these technologies are lessons learned from the oil and gas industry. And this rock sample in the middle is actually from a site that we drilled in Mississippi, where we took a rock, we took a sample, sent it to the lab, and we injected it with a epoxy. And the blue is actually the epoxy, and it just shows the magnitude of the pore space in this rock. So you could well imagine that anything that you were going to inject into that rock would easily go in that rock and migrate out. And as long as you had the cap rock on top of that rock, that would be a very good storage reservoir. And in the bottom left just shows your typical site of where you would, how you set up drilling a rig. It's 2 or 3 acres of land that you would need. And then at the end of that, we basically reclaim that land and it looks to original conditions. And all you see is a wellhead at that piece of property. Next slide. Very important is reservoir modeling. So after you get this geological information, you've got to do something with it so you can put it into models. And just like oil and gas companies model how much oil and gas they can take out of the subsurface environment, we have really honed in on tools and reservoir simulation experiences where you can understand how the CO2 will move. As long as you've got good geological data going into these models, you will have good results coming out of these models. So the picture on the left is from Mississippi, from a site that we drilled some wells and we proposed. We have a Class 6 UAC permit applications in front of Region 4 EPA right now for injecting CO2. And it shows the simulation, and it gives us a really good understanding of what the plume's going to look like over time and where it's going to go and where it will be in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Next slide. Injection operations. This was from an actual project that we did down in Mobile County at Plant Berry, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But from the standpoint of doing the CO2 injection, it's pretty boring. I mean, you have generally a metering station in the top right, which is going to monitor the amount of CO2 that's moving through a pipeline going down to an injection site. You might have a valve station, or what they are also called pigging stations, where you would have where the CO2 pipeline would come up to the surface, where you could put tools down to monitor the integrity of the pipeline if there's any issues going on like that. And then you have a surface pump, which is the bottom left. And then you have a wellhead, which is the bottom right. And in the background of that wellhead, you can see that surface pump. So it's basically just that, that one wellhead where the CO2 is going in and going down into the subsurface. And all this is very well understood from oil and gas operations in the past. Next slide. So if you look at the geology of the Southeast United States, and this is, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, looks very familiar, and the Florida Panhandle, you've got 3 distinct physiographic provinces. You've got the Gulf Coastal Plain, which is in the southern part, and it kind of wraps around into Georgia, goes up into South Carolina, and goes up through Mississippi and goes into Texas. You've got the Piedmont. So the Piedmont is igneous and metamorphic rocks that you would use for construction and stuff like that. Some of those are mined at the surface. They have no porosity and permeability. That area is really off the table for even considering to do any CO2 storage. You've got the Valley and Ridge, which is an area of geological formations where you've had a lot of tectonic activity. You've got some folding and some faulting. Birmingham is in the Valley and Ridge. You come up to Birmingham, you kind of see the mountains and you kind of, see the valleys. And that's the Valley and Ridge physiographic province. So if you look at, just for example, for all the Southern Company plants, we've got down in the Mobile area, we've got Plant Berry, Washington Cogen, and Plant Theodore. Next slide. This is where we've drilled wells looking at site characterization. Some of this has been on, Southern Company. We have just, spent our own money doing this. Some of this has been in cooperation with the Department of Energy, but we have taken a lot of time to go out and characterize different sites to understand the geology and understand the feasibility of doing storage in these areas. Next slide. And then the other thing that's kind of happening right now is there's a lot of what we would call regional storage hubs, or DOE is funding the carbon safe work where projects like, Project Timberland and Longleaf in South Alabama are being, funding is going into drilling and doing site characterization to understand the geology. So beyond what we've been doing internally at Southern Company, the Department of Energy is funding a lot of work. And you can see that there's frankly, a lot of activity that's going on down in the Mobile area. And a lot of that is because the geology is very suitable for this technology down there. In fact, it's suitable in most all the area of the Gulf Coastal Plain. Next slide. So if you look at the areas where we just really don't feel like we have the feasibility, it's in that area of the Piedmont. And keep in mind that Piedmont geology just doesn't stop. It kind of goes down into the subsurface geology. And even though the coastal plain overlaps it, for CO2 to be stored, you need to get down below depths of around 2,500 or 3,000 feet. So in those areas where we have the hatched line there, really you can't do storage because if you were drilling the well down an injection well, you would hit the actual Piedmont rocks, which you can't do storage in. So you really have to be south of that line. So it does start limiting where we can and can't do that in the Southeast. Next slide. And if you look at the distinction between the coastal plain and the valley and ridge, in the coastal plain, we generally have flat-lying rocks. Their continuity is very exceptional. I mean, you can drill a well 3 or 4 or 5 miles apart and you almost find the exact same geology. So when we go to if we ever decide to do storage in these areas, or storage is being done in these areas, the permitting would be straightforward. It would be, I don't want to say easy, because the permitting process, like Noah pointed out, is very robust. It's very onerous on demonstrating that these sites are safe, which is good. We want that because we need good risk management tools like robust permitting to make sure that we do this storage correctly. But up in the valley and ridge, it's a little more site specific. You're going to have a little more where it's going to be a little more challenging. You're probably going to have to drill more wells. You're going to have to do more studies to really determine that you have a very good storage site. Next slide. So I just wanted to talk real quick, and I'll be done in a second, about a project we actually did in Mobile County. So some of you may or may not be in the loop that this project took place. But we had a site down at Plant Berry where we built a kind of a slipstream 25 megawatt carbon capture unit. We developed a 12-mile pipeline over to Citronelle, up towards Citronelle Dome, to the city of Citronelle. And we captured CO2 at that site, and we transported some of that CO2. It took us a while to get the capture unit up and running. And we actually injected some CO2 into a deep saline formation at about 9,400 feet deep. So keep in mind, like Noah said, the storage of these sites, it's between 1 and 2 miles deep where we're looking. So these are very, very deep formations, and it's not anything close to underground sources of drinking water. All the characterization and permitting work that goes into developing these sites is going to demonstrate that they're going to be safe, and the CO2 is going to stay in the ground for millennia. Next slide. So this is the capture plant. This is one of the amine plants, like John pointed out. You can see the absorber tower and the regenerator there. It gives you an idea of the size of this plant. Next slide. We actually built it in Tuscaloosa and barged it down the Alabama River and constructed it in a modular form. Next slide. And we actually put in a CO2 pipeline, a 12-mile CO2 pipeline. And I was personally very excited about this pipeline, because this pipeline, we actually ran the majority of it along an existing transmission corridor, which provided for an existing easement, which made it a lot easier to do this from the standpoint of we could use it as a construction.
I'm sorry I've been so rude on phone. It's a work.
Good. But we built this pipeline and was able to use existing right-of-ways, which I think is really good for the environment, because we're not cutting down trees or going into ecosystems that don't already exist along that pipeline. Next slide. And we did have, we had to deal with some endangered species like the gopher tortoise. So there were some of them along this right-of-way, and we had qualified people come in and relocate them and then bring them back to their burrows after this all took place. And actually, it was interesting. Actually, after we built the pipeline, that provided a really open area where a lot of the gopher tortoises tended to congregate, because they liked that new dirt that we had laid down associated with the pipeline, and they made more burrows right back in that local area. Next slide. Okay, so that's all I had. I tried to keep us on schedule, get us back on schedule.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much, both you and John. Really appreciate this and the depth with which you covered both the capture and the storage pieces. Folks can please drop in additional questions. We have a few more minutes. The first question, though, that the estuary program popped in there was, is there an energy penalty of creating one of the wells relative to how much CO2 it can hold? And I might add, additionally, the process of delivering the CO2 down into the reservoir, the energy process there. They were asking about that energy trade-off of the storage.
Do you want to cover that one, Richard?
Yeah, so at the storage, it's very de minimis. I mean, there's a pump I mean, along the, most of the energy penalty is he's nodding his head. He's going to talk about it. It's at the capture. Once you get it in the pipeline, it flows freely in the pipeline. You get to the pump, and the pump does run off electricity, but it's not a significant amount of electricity. And the interesting thing about these formations in South Alabama is they are so porous and permeable. Once you get the CO2 flowing in, you're not. So it is an underground injection control well, but you're really not injecting CO2, you're pumping it. Just keep in mind it's in a dense phase liquid form, and it's actually flowing into the well. And once you get it into the formation, it starts naturally going out into the formation, and the formation kind of pulls it in. So you're keeping it dense phase and you are pumping it into the well, but it's not a high energy intensity kind of injecting activity that you're doing with the CO2 storage.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
And then,
just to add to what Richard said, you would have a compression station at the capture unit to be able to get to pipeline pressure conditions. So there would be the energy penalty associated with that. If you look at that compared to the capture unit, it's about half and half. So half of the overall energy penalty comes from the capture system, half of it comes from compression.
okay. Just a follow-on question I might add is around the energy penalty for the different capture technologies. Do you share a little bit more about kind of your sense of where that energy penalty is overall for each of them, and then where you think the most promise is to advance those technologies to reduce that energy penalty?
Yeah, so I think, if you go back to the slide that I was talking about around kind of absorption and adsorption based processes, most of that energy is in the form of heat. And so you're using that heat to regenerate the process and produce the CO2. The membrane and cryogenic separation steps are really more electrical energy requirements. And so I think that if you look at it today, solvents are probably the front runners, especially for really large volume capture. So if you're talking about a large power station, I think that probably is the technology that you would choose. The cryogenic systems are something that's very interesting. I think you have an opportunity to pair that with some smaller sources that you might find at certain industries. And because it's modular, it may integrate better at a site like that. So positives and negatives for each one of the technologies. I think it's when it comes down to the application that you'll kind of select amongst those depending on conditions that you need to meet.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then when you think about the opportunities for coastal Alabama, where do you see some of the deployment opportunities potentially being? We have the Tenaska Longleaf facility up and opening. Given the industries that exist, especially in the Mobile region, do you all have a sense for where some of those opportunities are for carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, I'll let Richard answer too, but I would say kind of the Mobile area is prime from a standpoint of you do have so much industry located or co-located near each other, and so there's an opportunity to share common infrastructure. So if you think about pipelines, you think about storage sites, there's an opportunity to share that cost amongst potentially multiple organizations, multiple industries. And so having all of that in close proximity, especially in Mobile, I think, and knowing that you have good storage geology creates kind of a unique opportunity for the technology.
Yeah, I would reiterate what John said in that there's a reason that Mobile is getting so much attention right now in this technology is because of the emitting facilities there that need to be abated from the CO2 emissions in the close proximity of CO2 geology. I mean, there's a lot of industries that would like to decarbonize with CCS, but they don't want to build a 50 or 100 or a 200-mile pipeline to get the CO2 to the sites. Most of those industries on Highway 43 in and around Mobile are going to have very close access to good, very, very world-class storage geology. And with shared infrastructure, those costs can be reduced significantly with the development of like what Tenaska's Longleaf project and Blue Sky's Timberland project and all the work that's been done right down there has demonstrated over and over very good storage geology.
Excellent.
And Amy, the other thing I'll mention real quick that I didn't mention on my presentation is that the state of Alabama is now the regulation of CO2 injection is through the Environmental Protection Agency through the different regions. And so Alabama falls under Region 4, but the state of Alabama with the Oil and Gas Board and the Geological Survey is now developing and about to submit a primacy application. So they would have the authority to regulate CO2 injection in the state of Alabama. Now, that'll take 2 or 3 years for that to end up coming to pass, where they would get that primacy to be able to regulate that. But I think that's a good thing for the state of Alabama, because you got local regulators who understand local geology, and they've been working with the oil and gas industry. They are the best situated people to regulate this industry in Alabama.
Has that historically happened for other states who filed for that, or is that something that's a given?
Yeah, there's only 3 other states that have primacy. It's North Dakota, Wyoming, and Louisiana just got it. Mississippi is applying. Georgia has expressed interests, but it's a 3 or 4 year process from the time that a state says, we want to get primacy, to developing that application, going through the public notice process, submitting that application to EPA, them reviewing it, them issuing it, and the state adopting it. So it takes a while.
Well, we had one other question just about the lifespan of the solvents used in absorption and the waste streams. Those are handled quickly, and then we should wrap because we're already at time. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, so based on the testing that we've done, there is some amount of makeup that we would anticipate as you operate a solvent-based system over time. That is actually, relative to the other operations and maintenance cost of the system, a relatively low component. And there are, as a part of the system, there are things that are developed to help reclaim the solvent and reuse the solvent, minimize any potential waste stream that might be generated, and then that would be appropriately managed as a part of that facility's permitting process.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and for sharing your expertise. We look forward to staying in touch and in conversation about these opportunities with the Business Resource Committee and otherwise, as Mobile the region continues to lead in this opportunity area. So thank you everyone for participating, joining us for this, and we'll do a follow-up email with some additional information. Hopefully we can share the decks that were shared today. And again, thank you very much for being here. We'll be back in touch with our next webinar, which will be all about the circular economy. So carbon's piece of that, but the broader circular economy, and then a third one on nature-based solutions. So thank you again. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.